Hello and welcome to the PAPO Podcast, your weekly dose of podcast recommendations. I'm your host, Mary Jane Rewa, and in this series, I muse over the podcasts that I have enjoyed so that you might too. From business and careers to true crime, sport, pop culture, and everything in between, I aim to bring a broad range of recommendations to you, the avid podcast listener. Thank you for joining me on my ramblings, and with that said, let's get into today's episode. Today's first recommendation is Boardroom Out of Office, hosted by Rich Kleiman and Gianni Harrell. This interview-based series provides an inside peek into the minds and experiences of incredibly accomplished and innovative thinkers and doers in business, sport, technology, entertainment, media, and so much more. Kleiman himself is a successful businessman and sports manager who not only has a wealth of experience and deep curiosity for people, but who also appears to be insanely well connected. Side note, the power of fostering relationships and building networks is a recurring theme across this podcast series. But I digress. In this podcast, you get to hear firsthand the stories of Kevin Durant, Jimmy Iovine, Larry Jackson, Jack Dorsey, Ariana Huffington, Omar Raja, a ton of sports stars, and so many more. This podcast, now having surpassed its 50th episode, provides hours of some of the most compelling and inspirational storytelling out there. It's also important to highlight that Kleiman's closeness with some of his guests affords the podcast a truly unique level of authenticity and easy intimacy, if you know what I mean. While Harrell, I believe he's in his 20s, provides a youthful perspective that I guess we all need. It strikes a brilliant balance between chewing the fat and delving deeper into challenges and achievements that influence the lives and careers of these true change makers. There are so many beautiful little nuggets of advice peppered throughout each episode. It's definitely a podcast where you can take on whatever you need in that moment or simply enjoy the storytelling. This is not your average business or career-focused podcast. It is so much more than that, and I love it. It is one of my absolute favourite podcasts of all time and comes highly recommended. Episodes run from around 40 to 90 minutes in duration and are uploaded weekly on Wednesdays. So what are you waiting for? Now, I don't know about you, but if you are anything like me, the current news cycle can leave you feeling frazzled, frustrated, and sometimes even less informed than you feel you should be. News moves so quickly and it takes a lot of work just to keep up. Enter the Slow Newscast, an elegantly composed weekly podcast that focuses on one story per episode. Hosted by journalist and editor of Tortoise Media, Basha Cummings, time is taken to investigate and report on important news that may have been gobbled up by or missed in the chaos of how we normally consume news. Underpinning each episode is robust investigative journalism, a clear narrative, and we often hear the voices of people directly involved in any given story. It makes for utterly compelling, engaging, and often moving listening. The Slow Newscast doesn't shy away from the difficult or challenging, often tackling stories of murder, corruption, human rights abuses, big pharma, you get the drift, the powerful. Recently, the Slow Newscast has interrogated Pfizer's operations since the emergence of the pandemic and, of course, its vaccine. It's covered the true impact of Trump's treatment of children, and families for that matter, on the border of Mexico, and it's highlighted how a certain social media platform influenced the reporting and investigation into the disappearance and eventual discovery of Gabby Petito this summer. So while the Slow Newscast covers often complex and sensitive topics, it's clear that the story is in safe hands. So, if you are looking for some solid investigative journalism, head over to the Slow Newscast for more. It really doesn't ask much from you from a time commitment perspective, with episodes running around 40 to 60 minutes long, and they are uploaded weekly on Thursdays. Today's third recommendation is Between Two Beers, a podcast hosted by two mates, Seamus Martin and Stephen Holloway, who interview some of the most prominent people in sports and journalism or broadcasting in New Zealand. Stephen is a sports journalist and Seamus a sports administrator turned marketer. Between them, they create a relaxed but thoroughly informed team, comfortably navigating interviews with a broad range of guests and even some of their childhood heroes. I need to put my hands up and admit that I'm not a die-hard sports fan, not by a country mile. But as with all humans, whether they are accomplished sports people, business leaders, teachers, chefs, artists, whatever they may be, there is always more to their story than their more publicly facing or acknowledged achievements. And while the podcast focuses on these aspects of their guests' lives, Seamus and Stephen take it a lot deeper, respectfully exploring their guests' paths to success, what happened behind the scenes, the challenges, the laughs, the sacrifices, and the learnings. If you are interested in the lives of others, this is a great listen. And being stuck in lockdown hasn't slowed these guys down either, with some of my favourite episodes having emerged from the latest New Zealand lockdown period. As I mentioned, I'm not a massive sports fan, but if you were to press me on who my favourite New Zealand sports person was, I wouldn't hesitate to say John Kirwan. He's always seemed to be such a gentleman, both on and off the pitch, and when I saw his name pop up on an episode title, I stopped what I was doing immediately and listened. John Kirwan is one of New Zealand's most loved and respected ex-All Blacks. He's a husband and a father, coach, a broadcaster, mental health advocate, author and entrepreneur. The life, or lives, he has lived, the stories he has to tell, and the wisdom he has to profit is immense, and we get to see just some of it in episode 59. Now into its 63rd episode, there is so much to explore with this podcast. Episodes do run kind of long, I think 90 plus minutes, and are uploaded weekly on a Sunday or a Saturday, depending on where you are in the world. If you've ever wondered where and how all of these new vapes and vape shops suddenly appeared from, then today's final recommendation might provide you with a few answers. Hosted by Laura Beale, the Vaping Fix breaks down the spectacular rise and eventual semi-fall of Juul, the Silicon Valley startup that set out to revolutionize the tobacco industry with its e-cigarette technology. If you're not familiar with Juul, for a while there it was one of, if not the most popular manufacturer of e-cigarettes, also commonly known as vapes. Essentially, the company designs and sells e-cigarettes that provide a nicotine hit without the side effects of inhaling burned tobacco as done when smoking cigarettes. And while its founders initially set out with altruistic ambitions, and Juul experienced what can only be described as extreme rapid success, a lot of that success was born of intense popularity among teenagers. And so, as users of Juul began suffering side effects and Juul's marketing practices became increasingly controversial, the company and its products began to attract escalating controversy and scrutiny. Juul, for example, has had personal injury, government entity, and other cases filed against it. It has been investigated by the FDA. Its availability in certain markets is completely banned, and so much more. That little tidbit barely scratches the surface, which is why I recommend the Vaping Fix. This podcast does a great job of dissecting the fascinatingly potent story of Juul over a gripping 6-part series. Episodes are about 30 to 45 minutes long and were all released earlier this year, so it's just sitting there waiting for you to find it and binge your little heart out. That brings me to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to hear what you think of today's recommendations, and as always, if you have any recommendations of your own, please get in touch. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the PAPO Podcast. All of the podcasts mentioned in today's episode will be linked in the show notes below. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, and if you really liked it, please give us a review over on Apple Podcasts. It really helps others to find us. If you have any podcast recommendations of your own or any feedback on today's episode, please get in touch via social media or email. All of the details about how to find us will be in the description box as well. Finally, the song you hear on this podcast is called Glow by Sensho, which I sourced through Uppbeat.io.